Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to our panel discussion on the crisis in Ukraine. My name is Sarah Phillips. I'm the director of the Robert F. Burns Russian and East European Institute here at Indiana University. I'm also a professor in the Department of Anthropology. I'm also an anthropologist of Ukraine. I want to thank my colleagues from across the College of Arts and Sciences at Indiana University who have made themselves available on very short notice this afternoon to share their expertise with us, to discuss the current crisis in Ukraine from many different disciplinary perspectives, from the disciplines of political science, from anthropology, from history, from military science, and from geography. Very grateful to all of you for making yourselves available. I wanted to give a little overview of how our session will work this afternoon. Each of our panelists is going to speak about the crisis in Ukraine from their disciplinary perspective, from the perspective of their own expertise. Then we will take questions in the Q&A. So if you have a question for one of our panelists or for multiple panelists, go ahead and do leave that question in the Q&A function. We likely will not have time to get to all of your questions, but we will try to do our best to maybe collect questions and address them in a collective manner. And so I'd like to go ahead and start and ask Colonel Robert McVeigh, who is REEI's U.S. Army War College Russian and East European Strategic Fellow, to talk to us, Colonel McVeigh, about the situation in Ukraine. It was a very devastating night for the Ukrainian people. Lots of military attacks coming from all sides, and we'd like to hear from you what things look like right now, what the strategy is, and what we might expect going forward.
Yeah, well, thank you from the beginning. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join this distinguished panel today. I'd like to start with the obligatory disclaimer that the views expressed here are my own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Department of the Army, Department of Defense, or the United States government. And as Dr. Phillips mentioned, we're in the very early hours of an extremely fluid situation in Ukraine, in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And what we're seeing right now are numerous unconfirmed, conflicting reports of what's happening on the ground that are available via open source intelligence methods. And so what we're seeing is a coordinated air, land, and sea invasion from Russia, Belarus, and through the Crimean regions into Ukraine. We've seen reports of numerous cruise missile strikes throughout the country, the air landing of paratroopers, possible activities of special operations forces that have been centered on destroying and securing key airfields and air bases, air defense and command and control nodes, as well as logistics. All of this is being done to set the military conditions necessary to achieve what President Putin has stated as his political objectives. Those are two parts to his stated political objectives. One is the stated objective to change the regime in Ukraine and replace it with a regime that is compliant to Russia. And secondly, to demilitarize Ukraine, taking it back to a pre-2014 level of military development. He states that he also has no plans for the Russian military to occupy Ukraine, and that he plans to withdraw forces as soon as he accomplishes these objectives. These objectives, military and political objectives, don't seem to be possible without a long-term occupation, because it appears that President Putin is basing the military operations on some a very important faulty assumption, and that is one is that he will find a Ukrainian population that is sympathetic to the invading forces. I just want to take it back to history a little bit to look at U.S.-led coalition operations in Desert Storm to invade a country of similar land size and population size as Ukraine, and I'm mentioning Iraq. In order to do that, the U.S.-led coalition brought together a military force that approached 1 million soldiers, airmen and sailors. The latest reports on what number of forces that Russia has compiled are upwards of 190,000 forces, which makes it very unlikely to be able to sustain a long-term operation in this country. What many military observers and analysts thought was that we would see a Russian shock and awe campaign reminiscent of trying to replicate what the U.S. did in Desert Storm. And initially, I said, as reports are still coming in, what has been surprising to military analysts is that this Russian invasion has been a softer approach. Now we're seeing widespread cruise missile strikes across the country, but nowhere in the numbers, nowhere in the concentration that we would have expected in shock and awe. Also in a shock and awe campaign, you would look at the Russian military taking out telecommunications nodes, and that has not happened. Electrical nodes, power generation sources, and that is just not happening. So the question is, what does this softer shock and awe approach mean from Russia? On one hand, it could mean that Russia is looking at opportunities to be able to ramp it up or scale it up in the future, depending on what the situation on the ground is. Or this could be examples of some military limitations that Russia poses. And while they'd like to replicate shock and awe, they just don't have those military capabilities to do so. So in summary, what's happening on the ground is that we're seeing this Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine as representing the greatest threat ever to the U.S. established international rules-based order that has kept the relative peace since World War II. And then I want to talk about what we're going to see over the next 24 to 48 hours. So what's already occurred today, as of this morning, is we have 4 NATO allies, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, who have invoked Article 4 of the NATO treaty. Article 4 of the NATO treaty, which is lesser known than Article 5, is that the parties will consult together whenever, in the opinion of any of them, the territorial, political independence, or security of any of the parties is threatened. So those 4 NATO allies have already called for consultations. And we know that Lithuania as well declared a state of emergency in their country. And we know from the Secretary General today that NATO will hold a meeting tomorrow. What are some of the actions in the near term that NATO could take to respond to this Russian invasion of Ukraine? Well, possibly NATO could authorize and order the deployment of the French-led NATO Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, possibly to Romania or another location closer to Poland. We could look at increasing the size of the NATO Enhanced Forward Presence units that are currently in the 3 Baltic nations in Poland. Those are about a battalion-sized element, so anywhere from 6 to 1,000 soldiers. We could look to increase those to brigade-sized elements. That would be anywhere from 3,500 to 5,000 troops in each of those countries. One thing that's also, we have an air policing mission that currently NATO exercises. we could look at possibly changing the rules of engagement that have been issued to those pilots from ones that are ready for air policing to more of an air defense mission. And then we should also look at stepping up our partnerships with Sweden and Finland. I know there's going to be some concerns about what to do with refugees, which could be upwards of 5 million. There's questions about whether or not a no-fly zone is feasible. And then I just wanted to mention some of the questions for kind of long-term future. This has really called into question the deterrence value of sanctions. The sanctions have failed to prevent this invasion, and it'll take a relook at kind of deterrence by denial or punishment. And I could talk about some other kind of military pieces, but I'll wait for those to follow up there. Dr. Phillips.
Thank you so much, Colonel McVeigh. That's such a great, if very sobering overview. I'll just add that we have also heard that the Russian forces have taken the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. I'd love to hear more about the implications of that. Maybe we'll save that for the next round. I also wanted to offer a few numbers. I'm looking at Hromadske, which is a very reliable Ukrainian news outlet. As of the evening to tonight, it's evening in Ukraine, the Ministry of Internal Affairs reports 57 Ukrainians dead and 169 wounded. Actually, that's the Ministry of Health is reporting that. Many cities and regions in Ukraine are under martial law. And as Colonel McVeigh mentioned, there were military assaults from 3 sides into Ukrainian territory. So I'd like to move now to ask Professor Laszlo Borhi, who is a professor in Central Eurasian Studies here at IU and author of the book Strategies of Survival, Life and Death Between Hitler and Stalin, as well as the book Dealing with Dictators, the United States, Hungary, and East Central Europe, 1942 to 1989. Professor Borhi, we're dealing with a dictator here. Can you put this in historical perspective for us?
Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak in this very bad hour. I have to say that most of us or all of us hope would not come. But I have to say that this was predictable and was predicted. Of course, I vividly remember the regime change which I experienced in Hungary in 1989, 1990. All of us hoping that this would be a different world. But looking at it soberly, there was very little chance for that. Kenneth Waltz and George F. Kennan, to name just 2 very well-known experts, warned of consequences of NATO expansion to the east. And what we are now seeing is a typical case of the Hobbesian trap, or as it is better known in international relations theory, the security dilemma. What is security for one is insecurity for the other. There's no absolute security. What is absolute security for one is absolute insecurity for the other. The other point I want to make is that the relationship between Russia and the West is a very interesting one if you look at the past 200 years. Going back to the Napoleonic Wars, it's a course I'm teaching at Indiana University. Looking at patterns in history, patterns in the history of international politics. And if you remember, in 1814-15, the coalition with Russia and other European states against France almost broke down and went into a Franco-Russian alliance precisely over the territories that are now disputed, Ukraine and Poland. And if you look at the history from then on, it goes from a pro-Western Russia to a very hostile Russia in the Crimean War, and then back again in the 1890s through the First World War, and then a German-Russian coalition, Rapallo in 1939, and then of course the Grand Alliance, and almost suddenly into the Cold War. So for a very amicable relationship between the Soviet Union and the Western world, United States and Britain, in very little space of time, developed into the most dangerous conflict of human history, which was the Cold War, colored, of course, by nuclear politics. And you mustn't forget that the atomic weapon changed the way international relations work in a very, very profound manner. And this is what we have to keep in mind in the current crisis. And then, of course, 1989, 1990, we see a rapprochement between the Soviet Union, Russia, and the West for a fleeting moment in history. But few of us actually believe that history was over, because great powers are great powers, and they always act the same way. Security and aggression, two sides of the same coin, two sides of the same coin. Don't want to take up too much time though. So this pendulum can swing back and forth. And of course, the other pendulum we're seeing swinging back is going back to the period of Sino-Soviet alliance. So again, this is the Cold War coming back in 1950. Moscow and Beijing signed an agreement which created what they call the Sino-Soviet bloc. And that was a very scary scenario then, and is an even more scary scenario today, even though the roles have been reversed. Russia is now the junior and China is the senior player. The big problem is, and we have to, if we want to be intellectually honest, is that after 1989, the victorious powers, quote unquote, of course, made the same mistake as they did in Paris in 1919. In Paris, they erected a security design that was not backed up by power. After 1989, they forgot to convene a peace conference and create a lasting security structure in Europe. In 1989, they left out Russia and Germany. In 1919, in 1989, Russia was left out, and unfortunately, we are now seeing the consequences of that. The next point I want to talk about a bit is the danger of escalation. And just to recall a very scary night I had in the presence of a former CIA director, Stan Turner, who told us a story. And that story was that in 1979, the world almost went to a nuclear war. And why so? Because the US computer that was supposed to check whether ICBMs were coming in had a technical glitch. And it took the wisdom of Zbigniew Brzezinski that they waited 5 more minutes until the US first strike capability was launched. And actually something very similar happened in '83 on the other side. So this is a situation where very sober minds and cool heads must prevail. And if you don't get the point, please read Marty Sherwin's Gambling with Armageddon, who shows that we were even closer to a nuclear war in '62 than we actually believed. And that was partly because of the recklessness of the administration on both sides in 1962. And the final point, and this came up, and I'll be done very quickly, is economic sanctions. I think they should have been imposed much sooner. I think that there's always a problem about economic sanctions between the two parts of the Atlantic. That is the experience of the Cold War. Obviously, those sanctions were insufficient to rein in Russian politics. But having said that, we cannot expect too much. I was a student of the economic embargo of the Cold War. And unfortunately, the lesson that we can discern from the Cold War is that economic sanctions in and by themselves do not achieve the political aims they are meant to achieve. So they can cause problems, they can cause discomfort, even economic dislocation. But unfortunately, I have to say that it is unlikely that it will topple the current political regime in Russia. They are very resilient to this. And very finally, I want to say that I often hear this argument that Russia is a small economy. I mean, yeah, per capita. But if you look at Soviet history and the period of the German-Soviet Pact in 39, was that a large economy? I mean, in 89, the per capita, I mean, the size of the Soviet economy was equated with the one in Switzerland. But did that stop the Soviets from constructing 10,000 nuclear warheads? So there's only so far that this argument goes. So the fact that Russia is a declining power economically and demographically doesn't mean that it's less menacing and less dangerous. And just an anecdote for you to understand the mentality. When they invaded Budapest in Hungary in 1956, the Soviet troops were amazed by the enormous discrepancy of the standard of living that they saw, even in Stalinist Hungary, as opposed to the Soviet Union. But the common reaction was that we have the tanks, so they have the hard power. So they are willing to invest in the military, and they are willing to invest in grandeur. And what is happening, and that is my conclusion, it's a strategic repositioning of Russia. So they never really accepted what happened in 1991. Aside from a small circle of people around Gorbachev, the Soviet military, political, and party elite deplored what Gorbachev did. They saw it as a betrayal of the victory in the Second World War. And more than that, they saw it as the relegation of Russia to the periphery of Europe. And if you come to think of it, if they control Ukraine, they are restoring partially the positions they had under the Soviet Union that made them a global power. And that is the Carpathian passes. And that, to me, doesn't look good. Because if you control the Carpathian passes, you control the gateway to Europe. And that is why Stalin seized it in 45. And as you know, in 1953, and if he had not died, Stalin would have launched the Third World War. So this is it's not just about NATO, and most commentators miss this point. So this is a strategic position for Russia that they lost in 91, and now they seize an opportunity to regain it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Borhi. I would like to turn now to Professor Padraig Kenny, Professor of History and International Studies at Indiana University. Professor Kenny, in your academic biography, you say, I want to understand how groups of people and individuals without power manage, survive, resist, and protest in hostile environments. And that focus could not be more relevant to our discussion today. So I'd like to know if you could talk more about Ukrainian self-identity, about social mobilization in Ukraine, and the meaning of revolutions. What are we seeing unfold in the Ukrainian context right now under this Russian aggression?
Sure, thank you. And I'm really glad we can get together to think through what's going on right now in Ukraine. You know, the place I'd like to start is that ethnicity is not destiny. We will continue to hear about Russians who live in areas of Ukraine that have been invaded by Russia, and sometimes hear that, you know, in this area or that area live hundreds of thousands or millions of Russians. It's always important to remember that their Russian ethnicity does not mean that they welcome the invasion and that they wish to be annexed to Russia or liberated from Ukraine. This is an argument that we sometimes fell prey to during the Yugoslav wars, that because somebody was of this ethnicity or that ethnicity, that they naturally wanted to be liberated from Yugoslavia or from Bosnia and what have you. And that is a direction which leads towards genocide. I don't know how far I want to go down that direction, down that path, but that is something to be really concerned about. Putin wants to make the argument that to be Ukrainian is to be hopelessly Soviet, that the Ukrainian identity is one that was created by the Soviet Union. He said it's a Bolshevik or communist identity. Look, nothing could be further from the truth. The Ukrainian identity is a very real one, and I'll say something about that in a moment. But his argument can fall on willing ears if we're willing to think that, well, you know, they used to be together. There's thousands of years of or 1,000 years of history together, and so it would only be natural. They share religious traditions and so on. Again, that's falling into a trap that relatively small ethnic differences can actually mean some kind of destiny. In fact, the Ukrainian identity is a very real one. And here I'd like to think rather about the recent history. Ukrainians have generated 3 peaceful democratic revolutions in the last 3 decades. In 1989, 1991, when it was Ukrainian mobilization as seen on the streets of Lviv and Kiev that contributed quite fundamentally to the breakup of the Soviet Union, which was not simply a breakup, a falling apart, but was people asserting their right to be self-governed. Then many will remember the revolution of 2004, the so-called Orange Revolution. That's one that's often we remember because the leader of it was a presidential candidate whom the other side tried to kill with dioxin, and his face was horribly disfigured. And that too was very much a peaceful revolution. And then we have the so-called Maidan Revolution, the European Revolution of 2013, 2014, which also, although we now think of it in terms of the invasion of Crimea and of Eastern Ukraine, was also very much a peaceful revolution. But here's what's important about those revolutions. If you look over those 3 decades, we can see how in each of them, ideas about democracy, ideas about Europe, and most important, ideas of what it means to be part of a nation have shifted in meaning. In fact, I was thinking today that, you know, I mean, there have been a lot of changes in Europe over the last 30 years, but I think that no country in Europe has seen as dramatic a shift in orientation and thinking as has Ukraine. If in 1991 or so, the orientation towards those ideas of democracy in Europe and nation was maybe nominal and maybe not really well settled, I think that's really not true today. We have a very positive feeling towards all of those ideas today among both those who identify themselves as Ukrainian in ethnicity and also those who identify themselves as Russian in ethnicity. By no means universal, but very strongly. Now, I think a key question for anyone who studies social mobilization as I do is, okay, great, do those revolutions mean that Ukrainians will defend their country over a long period of assault? I mean, we're all rooting for the Ukrainians, or many of us are. It's hard not to, but over the long term, what does that mean? You know, that kind of social mobilization is really hard to predict. On the plus side, we have that civic mobilization over the last 30 years. Ukrainians do consider themselves a community. They are organized as citizens, and that is a really important part of it. On the other hand, if we think about periods of long social defense where people are willing to take up arms or build barricades or organize in the underground, what have you, this often thrives when people believe they will eventually be supported by allies. Even if they're deluded, as Poles were in 1939 or 1944 when the Allies did not come to their defense, still that belief in support is incredibly important. So the lack of that support, to the extent that it is there, could sap people's willingness to continue to fight. I think there's one last point I'd like to make, because as a historian, I mean, any historian is often asked about, you know, why is this happening? And I have to say that, which I often said during the Yugoslav wars, sometimes history jumps the rails of explanation, and the search for why is actually a dead end. This is, I believe, one of those moments. Even if we feel we understand Putin's grievances, or we feel we've got a handle on the long history of Ukraine and Russia and their relations, we still come short because when we're dealing with a dictator who has made a decision, which has, as the previous two speakers have pointed out, is contrary to Russia's interests, is contrary to their needs, there's a point at which the logic of history breaks down. And that, unfortunately, is where we are today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kenny, for that amazing insight. And we have lots of related questions in the Q&A function. I promise we are going to get to some of these questions. Lots of concern here about what are the chances this turns into World War III? What are the chances the conflict ends soon? What are Ukraine's neighbors going to do? Is NATO going to support in a really substantial way? So lots of really important and interesting questions that we will get to. I do want to turn now, however, to Irina Voloshina. Irina is a PhD student here at Indiana University in folklore and ethnomusicology. Irina hails from Ukraine. She's a specialist in Ukrainian culture. Irina, I know this is a very difficult time for you, for your family. I know you're on very little sleep right now, but really welcome your perspectives. What do you want people to know about the situation in Ukraine?
Thank you so much for inviting me. Indeed, it was a very hard night. So I'm an international student from Ukraine. My whole family is in Ukraine right now. And I was actually on the phone with my friend when it was 5 o'clock in the morning last night. She could not sleep because she heard explosions. And she called me because she knew that, you know, in the US, I would be the only one who is awake. And we were looking for live updates on the media, and we found that the first explosions were noticed. And then I had to call my parents, my sister, with dreadful words that wake up, there is war in Ukraine. So I would like to express the words from my colleagues in Ukraine, from folklorists and ethnomusicologists who actually reached out to me. They are not worried only about their lives, but they're worried about the tangible and intangible cultural heritage of Ukraine. They reached out to me and to other colleagues abroad, asking if it would be possible at all to secure safe cloud space at the Library of Congress or any other place where they could store field recordings from their folklore expeditions in case there are explosions, cyber attacks, or looting, or anything like that. They are afraid that this information can be lost or damaged. Also, a director of Mistetsky Arsenal, the Art Arsenal, major art organization in Kyiv, a flagman institution, Olesa Ostrovska wrote on her Facebook that they, again, worrying about their own well-being and their lives. They are trying to protect the collections that they have, and she's asking for a fair representation in the Western media of all things Ukrainian art, literature, because we know that there is a lot of misinformation happening, targeting the very existence of Ukraine and its identity. So I think that's all I can say now, and I'm on live updates on Telegram live channels, and always in touch with my parents and my loved ones.
Thank you, Irina. Thank you for joining our discussion today. And that's something that I did want to mention as well. We don't have the chat function working right now just because there's so many people on the webinar, but we're looking for opportunities to share information, to share resources. And so I will be reaching out to you, Irina. Maybe we can put together a special website, some kind of portal for that. So again, thank you. And I'll just mention that Irina and other members of the Ukrainian Studies Organization are organizing a peaceful protest tomorrow on the IU campus to protest the Russian aggression in Ukraine. It will take place at the Sample Gates at 1 p.m. and all are welcome. I'd like to turn now to Professor Regina Smith. Professor Smith is professor of political science here at Indiana University. She is author of a new book, Elections, Protest, and Authoritarian Regime Stability, Russia 2008 to 2020. Professor Smith, what can you tell us about what's going on in Russia? How are people in Russia reacting to this conflict? I know I've seen a lot of social media posts about protests. I saw some news that possibly up to 1,000 people in Russia had been detained at political protests. Is that good information? Tell us what's happening in Russia.
So that particular information is just a little bit out of date. So there are about more than 1,500 people have now been arrested by the police for a protest. Excuse me, and excuse it, I have a little bit of a cold. I want to start actually by expressing my solidarity with Ukraine and our Ukrainian colleagues here at IU, and to underscore the importance of helping in all the ways that we can. Accurate information, as our chat is showing us with these wonderful questions, is a front in this war, and we all have a role to play in providing that information, and so I'm very grateful to be here. I just want to start briefly, and this reflects also some of the questions in the chat, about how to think about an illogical war. And we've already talked about the incomprehensibility of Mr. Putin and his thinking. But as a social scientist, I want to think more not only about this decision as a function of Putin's worldview, but as a strategy, and think about the timing in terms of policy. So I'm going to argue that this decision comes from two factors. And one is that I would say after 2014, and I'm sure there'll be some debate about this, President Putin and his allies came to see the durability of his own regime as absolutely equivalent to the survival of the Russian state and Russian sovereignty. Now, the problem with that worldview is that in 2022, the threat to the Russian state is not Ukraine, nor is it the West or even NATO, but regime failures. The pillars of legitimation of these regimes are not exactly crumbling, but they're showing weakness. Elections are clearly fraudulent. Inflation and economic stagnation are deepening. Attempts to instill values are not having deep effects. And what President Putin did was turn to increased repression as this began to appear on the streets of Russia last year, just a year ago now. And that repression is taking its own toll on regime support and legitimacy as it becomes increasingly clear that the cost of Putinism has been Russian sovereignty and the loss of strength. In contrast, despite Russian harassment, Ukraine was making political and economic progress, and it appeared that Western political crises, populist polarization, at least seemed to be waning, perhaps not as quickly as we all would like, but seemed to be winding down a bit. So Putin, in my experience, has gotten bad advice from his advisors 3 times, and each time he's reacted in the same way. And this is the 3rd time. The advice from his very conservative foreign policy advisors was that his action in the Ukraine would fragment the West and it would stand down, that it would reveal weakness, much as past refugee crises had revealed, that he could isolate the US from Europe, he could weaken global democracy, and that he would meet with capitulation in Ukraine. the advice was wrong. And what we're seeing is that, and let's talk about sanctions a little bit more later, President Biden is doing a pretty good job unifying the response, talking to our allies in Europe, finding common ground, and coming up with what might not be our best solutions, but solutions not to the fighting, but to undermine Russian strength. So, okay, these are very early days, but what is happening in Russia? Over the past decade, I would say that Russians have comforted themselves, and these aren't people who pay attention to politics or engaged in politics. They comfort themselves with the idea that Russia's a normal country and that they have a normal leader. And they liked Mr. Putin's sort of rationalism and his measured steps. Excuse me. And those people responded to Western rhetoric as hyperbole. But Russians are now finding that they too were wrong. It's going to take a while in the Russian media ecology for the reality of this war, the video, the aggression, the human rights violations, the violence to sink in and circulate around Russia. But already we see that intellectuals who last week were wavering, talking about their disappointment in the West for buying into the narrative of Biden and the CIA, are saying US intel was spot on, and this war is not legitimate, they were wrong. This is a moral shock to a country. And you're seeing, as Professor Phillips noted, you're seeing this moral shock be discussed and uncovered and to affect steps of the population in Russia. Over the past couple of months, I've been working with new data from last year that shows a lot of protest sentiment and built up protest capacity in Russia, and not only in big cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg, but across Russian regional capitals and even medium-sized cities. We're seeing people building social networks and ties to challenge the state. I'm not surprised that we're seeing protests across Russia. And here I think they've been a little bit bigger than people might have guessed. And here we're also seeing cultural leaders who haven't broken with the regime, break with the regime, and speak out against the war. We're even seeing business leaders and bankers speaking off the record to talk about their worried reaction, not only to the war, but to the sanctions. And so I think when we talk about sanctions, we need to think about their medium or longer term effects than just deterring the war, but how they're likely to shape the trajectory of what comes next. These are young people on the streets in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, in Perm, in Ekaterinburg today. And that's dangerous for the regime because it creates a bigger likelihood of backfire as their parents and grandparents, people in their close circle, don't like how they are being treated. And I think it's important to remember that even repression will be swift, it will be strong, it will be violent. We're already seeing that. But street actions are not the only way to contest this regime. And we've seen some of that contestation stop. So I'm going to stop there and eagerly listen for Professor Dunn to tell us what the result of this refugee crisis might look like for crisis in Europe.
Thank you so much, Professor Smith. Professor Dunn, indeed, some questions in the chat about where are refugees heading? What can we expect? Professor Elizabeth Dunn is Professor of Geography here at IU and the Director of the Center for Refugee Studies. So please.
Thank you very much. I would like to just say how familiar this feels to me after having been through the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008. And indeed, I think one of the things we often assume about wars is that they are emergent, that they come out of nowhere. And this war actually, I would argue, has been boiling along since April of 2008, when the Bush administration proposed that Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova might join NATO. Germany, which was dependent on Russian oil and gas, demurred on that one, but Angela Merkel signed an agreement that said that, quote unquote, one day these three countries would be members of NATO. And what that has happened is that there was a promise without any protection that came along with it, and that made these countries very vulnerable. So Putin responded by attacking Georgia very soon afterwards. And I think one of the things you see from the war in Georgia is how much of a template that has been for other forms of aggression that Russia has carried out. One is this principle that war is cheap, but occupation is expensive. And so I have been hoping for a long time that Russia will pull back to the occupied territories of Donbass, and will try and use a perch there, making it into a forward military base to control rump Ukraine, which it will then leave alone. That's a terrible outcome, but it seems to be the best possible resolution at this point. The other thing that Russia has learned is that wars have to be fought on land and in cyberspace, that public opinion globally matters dramatically. And so I want to echo what Professor Smith said about our responsibility for accurate and complete information, and especially to encourage people not to retweet or post things that are inflammatory and possibly untrue. And finally, I think one of the things that Putin learned is that in an age where there doesn't seem to be any verifiable truth, you can spin whatever story you want, including one that's in direct contradiction to facts on the ground. So I think it's obvious that in 2014, Russia said, there were soldiers in unmarked uniforms on the ground in Ukraine, and Russia was like, who, me? And it was really clear that they were attempting that strategy again now, and that was disrupted by US intelligence and the announcement of an imminent invasion. But what we have seen in each of these things, in Georgia in 2008, in Syria in 2011 to 2014, where a proxy war broke out, which Russia was involved in, and in the 2014 invasion of Ukraine, we're seeing them test Western response to aggression and find that there's no response at all. So we gave them permission for this invasion long ago. And I find sanctions to be the political equivalent of thoughts and prayers. Nice to hear about, but not particularly effective. So I think it suggests two really important things. One, that Western neoliberalism and Russian neo-imperialism have become comparable civilizational projects. That is, both sides are trying to instigate a mode of governance that has its own norms, its own standards of truth, its own bureaucratic processes, its own practices of violence. They're in direct opposition to one another, and they're both expansionist, so it means they're inevitably going to clash over territory. And this is not the last time that will happen. The other thing, reflecting back quickly on something Colonel McVeigh said, was that the post-World War II international order is absolutely dead. That order was premised on the notion that every sovereign state would respect the boundaries and the internal sovereignty of the others. And we've now seen that that Russia has no intention of respecting that international order. I would argue that that died in 2008 with the invasion of Georgia, but I don't think anybody noticed. I think it was surely dead when a proxy war interrupted in Syria, but it's absolutely obviously dead now. So the question is not when will things return to normal and we'll have the international order in Europe as it existed before. It's what will the new international order look like now that it's no longer premised on the fundamental notion of sovereign states as territorial containers, that is, with impermeable boundaries. As a corollary of that idea that these containers are now gone, we're going to look at what happens as borders disintegrate or change their natures. And that means we're going to have to contend with the mass movement of populations. It's long been said that mass population movement is the defining characteristic of the 21st century. A week ago, there were 85.5 million displaced people in the world. And I think by the end of next week, that could hit 90 million people. We could see 3 to 5 million people leaving Ukraine or being internally displaced inside Ukraine. And that raises a number of really fundamental questions, other than the immediate logistical ones of how are you going to house and feed these people? First of all, what does it mean to be a citizen now, when people can be passportized so quickly? So we saw people in Donbass being given Russian passports and rapidly evacuated to Russia. And it looks like 750,000 people have left Eastern Ukraine for Russian territory. We will see millions heading for EU borders. There's a stream of people leaving Kiev and Lviv tonight. What do we think about borders when those no longer contain the movement of either armies or civilians? What are borders for anymore? And how do they function as a means of indicating demarcated territory? I think we can ask what this does to the 1951 Convention on the Rights of Refugees. That UN convention was developed in the wake of World War II, the last time we had mass population movements on this grand a scale. So we know that the categories in the 1951 convention were really meant to define refugees as people who were being targeted individually for their political beliefs, or they were being targeted as members of an ethnic group. But now we're seeing that the majority of displaced people are collateral damage. They are moving because something else is being bombed. They are not themselves the target of aggression directly. So how do we think about them as migrants? Do they qualify as refugees? What if they're leaving, as millions will, because the economy in a place has been collapsed by the damage to infrastructure in a war? Are those refugees? Do they deserve sanctuary in a country like Poland or Germany? And finally, I think we're going to have to ask how we provide humanitarian aid in an age when refugees themselves and mass population movements have become weapons of war. It is not an accident that the Russians are bombing the western side of Ukraine. If they did not, the Ukrainian population could move from the east side to the west side and remained internally displaced. If you're bombing on the western edge of Ukraine, it's a signal that there is no safe haven anywhere in country, and it will unleash millions of people moving across the border. So that is a deliberate attempt by the Russians to create a refugee crisis in Western Europe. So what do? Do we provide aid to people, or do we try and convince them that it's not worth leaving because they'll be more miserable in Poland or Romania than they are in Ukraine? And I have one last point, which is about the underlying principle that's going on here. There's an anthropologist named Jakob Rigi who talks about the chaotic mode of domination. And he says it's a replacement for the kind of biopolitics that has characterized rule in Western Europe since the end of World War II. And the chaotic mode of domination is one in which there is the distinction between the legitimate use of force and illegitimate violence is collapsed, when the distinction between truth and falsehood no longer obtains, and when there is no distinction between thug and statesman. All of these things become blurred beyond recognition. And what it creates is a pervasive sense of disorientation, which is then used by a dominating power to govern a population which can't figure out which way is up. So I think what we will see is not a new international order, but an all-encompassing disorder that will be used to reorganize the balance of power in Europe and the world. So I would signal to us all that we should prepare for the world not to make much sense anymore, because that, in fact, is the point. Thank you.
Professor Dunn, a very, very sobering summary, and thank you for that. It really speaks to many of the concerns that we see in the Q&A about what is the world going to look like now? What are the implications of this for emboldening other world powers? That's something that has come up in the Q&A several times. How will other European states be affected by this crisis, either as havens for refugees or as parties in the conflict somehow? So I would like to get to some of these questions. One that is really top of mind, I can see in the Q&A, is this question of sanctions. It was mentioned by Professor Borhe that sanctions should have been imposed on Russia earlier. Others are wondering, are sanctions going to be effective at all? I know, Professor Dunn, your view, thoughts and prayers. What else could be done? What other sanctions, what additional sanctions might be imposed that might have more effect? I welcome the panelists' perspectives on the question of sanctions, where we've been, where we're going. Please give me a signal if you'd like to jump in. Yes.
Well, maybe I can explain the smart aleck remark about thoughts and prayers, but I think that it's obvious that the kinds of sanctions, like being barred from the SWIFT money transfer system, were coming. And I think that any oligarch in Russia would have been naive to think that they weren't going to be cut off from their bank accounts. Certainly, talking about it as President Biden has done, and then allowing days and days to lapse before they actually happen, has given anyone who could be affected by them time to prepare for them. So I don't think that that they are particularly useful, or that they'll make a particularly big difference, because I think that the powers that be are already prepared to deal with them.
Yes, Professor Smith.
So I want to disagree just slightly. I think that these sanctions aren't so much similar to the old sanctions of targeting specific oligarchs in order to punish them and try to create distance between Putin and his team. But I do think that some of that work will be done without sanctions, as we see growing attacks on dark money. And I would watch that space now, because I think we're about to see sort of global anti-corruption, shell company efforts. And I certainly hope we are. We've seen an uptick in the last 6 months, which is what leads me to expect that. But also, I would say these sanctions are profound, because what they're doing is hampering Russia's ability to make money from its oil. And that's a really significant change. Yes, Putin has a very large sovereign wealth fund. He also has a very expensive war on his hands. He has several other expensive incursions on his hands, and he has a stagnating economy with a very unhappy population. So that these sanctions, combined with Nord Stream, canceling the Nord Stream contract, really limit Putin's ability to make money from his big moneymaker, which is energy politics. And let me just add that Russia is very disadvantaged by its deal with China and pays a very low price relative to market prices. That gap just increased tremendously in the past 24 hours. And I'm really keen to see what the deal they got for the new grain deal and what prices they're paying, and whether they're also biased against Russia. So I think that was the point of sanctions. In my view, diplomacy was the tool to try to forestall the sanction, to renegotiate, rethink NATO, to rethink security architecture, all the things that people have mentioned. Sanctions are meant to punish, not deter.
Thank you, Professor Smith, and thank you for bringing up the issue of Nord Stream 2. That was something that several attendees asked to have addressed, so thank you very much for that. Colonel McVeigh, you had a response, and I'll just say perhaps something else you could address, Colonel McVeigh, is the role of Belarus. I think there's some confusion about the role of Belarus in the current conflict.
Sure, I just wanted to say that with sanctions, they're definitely an important step that the Western nations have taken, but they have proved insufficient. So they were insufficient, one, to deter Russian invasion, and unfortunately, sanctions take time to be effective, which is no comfort to those on the ground in Ukraine as military operations are occurring. I think it was important. President Biden, when he addressed the nation today, talked about personal sanctions, and in particular, personal sanctions against Putin, which I think the sanctions we've currently imposed are against a variety of Russian banks. We have imposed personal sanctions starting in 2014. They have not affected President Putin. And in response to that, President Biden said that personal sanctions against President Putin were still on the table, but not something that he was considering at this time. On your second question was on the role of Belarus. Belarus provided a convenient intermediate staging ground for Russian forces under the guise of regularly scheduled military exercises. And so they allowed the Russian military to drastically pre-position forces, logistics, and all the elements that would be necessary to carry out the invasion. And as we mentioned earlier, it provided one of the three avenues of attack into Ukraine. So it was very important. One very concerning aspect of Russian troops in Belarus is that although President Putin had said that they would withdraw following the end of the military exercises, not only Russian forces have invaded from Belarus, the rest of the Russian forces have remained in Belarus, which has been a long-term concern on Russia positioning forces there permanently.
Thank you, Colonel McVeigh. Yes, Professor Borje.
So sanctions, the problem is Europe's dependence on Russian energy. So what is going to happen? That is very problematic. And we have known this for a long time, that Europe is over-dependent on Russia, on oil, and particularly natural gas. And what happened is that they constructed Nord Stream 2 to make it even more dependent. So how is Europe going to move away from this is a question for the future. So in the Cold War, this was not the kind of equation. It started in the 80s. In Western Europe, of course, Eastern Europe is the traditional Cold War. Eastern Europe was always very dependent. And that has not really changed. So one thing to ponder is how we move away from that equation.
Thank you. I'd like to return to the question of potential crisis of internally displaced persons in Ukraine. I know I'm in touch with a lot of my friends and colleagues who are trying to get out of the major cities where they're located. We've all seen, coverage of, 40 kilometers of traffic heading in various directions in Ukraine. The sense is, and we see that in the Q&A as well, that a lot of Ukrainians are heading west, possibly trying to get into Poland. I know that the Fulbright office in Ukraine has moved to Warsaw temporarily and has some supports in place for folks. But I'd love to hear from you, Professor Kinney. I think you have some visibility on what's going on in Poland, what the situation is looking like.
Sure. Well, first of all, Poland cares a great deal about Ukraine. For better or for worse, I mean, Ukrainians might sort of roll their eyes at this, but certainly there's been a period over the last 30 years where Poles have seen themselves as kind of patrons of Ukrainian democracy, supporting it and believing that they can contribute to building Ukrainian civil society and democracy. And then, so that's one connection, and there were so many Poles who during both of the revolutions of 2004 and 2013-14 went to Kyiv to support the revolutions and to support their Ukrainian friends and colleagues. The other connection is that there is a very sizable Ukrainian community now living in Poland, measured in the millions. I think 1.5 million is the usual number I've seen, And these are people who are working in Poland. I mean, many of them as domestic workers, construction workers, things like that, but also working in the retail industry, in the service industry, and so on. One certainly hears Ukrainian spoken in any of the major cities in Poland. This has been true over the last 5 or 6 years. And Poles have a complicated relationship with this, but one of the things I think we see actually in the last, well, certainly in the last 24 hours is once again a kind of a mobilization of we need to be supporting the Ukrainians. This is what we do, and I haven't seen any kind of disagreement about this. And it is significant because it's just over the last few months that we've seen brutal actions by the Polish government on the Belarusian border in an effort to stop refugees from Afghanistan and elsewhere from crossing into Poland. And that's gotten really ugly, with people dying in the woods. In at least one case, the corpse of a refugee being dragged back across the border into Belarus so that Poles wouldn't have to deal with it. And so, I mean, that's been quite ugly. It rivals some of the things that we've done on our border, in fact, in some ways worse. But now there's a different situation, and Poles are definitely opening the borders, or what I'm seeing, although it's very early hours, is opening their borders to Ukrainians. I suspect that will continue. As far as there was a question in the chat or in the Q&A about what is the danger to Poland, and there are IU students there now or heading there. I was actually speaking with my daughter just this morning, and decided that she needed to go to Poland this coming weekend. And I'm not concerned about that. I don't think that we will see an escalation that brings Poland into the conflict in a direct way. It's harder to say about the Baltic countries because Putin's relationship with them is different, as we know. But Poland, as a member of NATO and as one of the largest armies in NATO, I think it's the 5th largest, if I remember correctly, is likely to play a role, perhaps not yet in arming or sending arms to Ukraine, but certainly in finding a way to support Ukrainians.
Thank you so much, Professor Kinney. Professor Dunn, and then Colonel McVeigh, and then Irina Voloshyna.
Yeah, I think it's really important to recognize that support in week 1 of a crisis and support at the end of 6 months are often radically different. And we certainly saw that in Germany, where Germans were largely supportive of the influx of 1 million Syrians until quickly they were not. And so Poland, the Peace and Justice Party, which is currently in power, has been historically extremely anti-refugee. Some of that is surely racism and anti-Muslim sentiment, but some of it is about the fact that refugees impose an enormous cost burden on their hosts. They impose a lot of spatial burden on their hosts, and they create a lot of social strain for their hosts. So my expectation would be that Poles will be very welcoming this week, but certainly by Christmas would not be as welcoming or as willing to have Ukrainians staying inside. I have heard reports of refugee camps being erected now on the Polish border.
Colonel McVeigh?
Yeah, I really appreciate Dr. Dunn's comments on refugees and the impact of internally displaced people. This is something that military planners have to take into great consideration. Not just military planners, the Russians as an invasion force, but also the Ukrainian defenders will have to, the pictures that we've seen today in the news of roads in Kiev being blocked, that not only blocks refugees trying to get out, it affects military traffic and ability to deploy where it needs to move. It affects local law enforcement and fire departments that may have to respond to actions on the ground, which is a problem. I think we've noticed a trend, at least since Syria, of Russia taking on a policy of what we'd call the weaponization of refugees. And what I think that we have not yet seen, based on their initial round of invasion, is something that looks like a systemic approach to that within Ukraine. We are seeing the Russian military hit targets throughout the country, to include Western Ukraine, but the targets in Western Ukraine have been so far limited to what I mentioned earlier: known logistics, air bases, weapons depots, and we're not seeing them attack the civilian population, which is what we saw in Syria, causing the mass exodus out of the country. The militaries, both in Poland and the Baltic states, Lithuania in particular, have already started establishing military refugee camps to receive these countries. And I think this is going to be one of the reasons why the 3 Baltic countries and Poland have initiated NATO Article 4, is that because a massive flow of refugees into their countries does pose a threat to them, not only territorial, but the security of their country.
Thank you, Colonel McVeigh. Irina Voloshyna, please.
Yeah, just to add from the live updates that I'm getting from the Telegram chat. So in addition to the martial law in Ukraine, President Zelensky announced that all males between the age of 18 and 60 are not allowed to leave Ukraine. So, and he announced a general mobilization and the territorial defense troops are given the weapons to protect their cities and towns. So there might not be a way to actually have refugees in Europe, even if people want to leave, they will not be able to. Or many families, I know that they would not want to live without their family members, fathers and sons. So that's of course a big question, but it's more complicated.
Thank you, Irina. So if I may, Irina, I don't want to put you on the spot, but we've had lots of people in the Q&A asking, how can we help, right? There's very little, people feel powerless, feel great empathy for the people in Ukraine. There are various websites that have been shared where folks can donate to support the Ukrainian army, but there are lots of other charities that are working in Ukraine. Can you tell us about some of them? And Professor Dunn, same question for you. I know you're very involved in this effort as well. I'm not quite sure how to share that information with our audience other than verbally right now. And then as we put together a portal at the reei.indiana.edu website, we'll share some of these resources. We'll also try to share them on the REEI social media. So Irina and then Professor Dunn, if you wouldn't mind to answer this question.
Yeah, so currently on the social media, there is one main source or fund to donate money to is savelife.in.ua. You can donate money there and it goes directly to the needs of the Ukrainian army. There is another post from the U.S. ambassador, Ukrainian ambassador in the U.S., Oksana Markarova. I'll forward the information. So a bank account information where people could donate, and this is official source. There was another fund where people can donate for medical needs in Ukraine, but this page disappeared. Patreon, I think it shut down that page, and something, so might look like a cyber attack, because the money from that account disappeared right before the page disappeared from the internet, and there was a big amount of money that people donated to. So I will share the sources that I know, but please, if you want to donate money, check if it's not a fake, because I accidentally shared something on my Instagram account this morning, and I received messages from my friends saying that it's been proven to be a fake. So please do not believe everything you see. Try to stick to the few main sources that check in with somebody who might know. I'll share everything I know, and I'll ask for more links from my friends in Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Irina. Professor Dunn and then Professor Smith, please.
Yeah, I'd like to first say that we need to think hard about the form in which we donate. Nobody needs your used clothes. Please do not send material objects, do not send Band-Aids, do not send shoes. Those are very expensive to ship in. They take valuable airport space, which can be used for other relief purposes and for evacuation purposes. And they're incredibly expensive in terms of staff time to ship, sort, move, distribute. Just send money. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that I think there's kind of a tension in how you donate. We will very soon, I imagine by tomorrow or the next day, see the international NGOs pouring in for a humanitarian response. So you'll see the International Committee of the Red Cross, you'll see the International Rescue Committee, Care International, Save the Children, World Vision, and so on. Those international NGOs managed to deliver 37 cents on the dollar to refugees. So for every dollar you donate, almost 3/4 of it is skimmed off by the agencies themselves as they subcontract. So on the one hand, you get a much more organized response, and on the other hand, you find that it's not very financially efficient. So I really encourage you to take the risk and donate to local NGOs who are routing money directly to affected people. It's true that they might be a fake, but they also might get a lot more of your money where it needs to go fast. So I suggest you do that. And I know that Irina will be posting those. I don't have any leads right now. I've only seen support for the Ukrainian army, which I myself have some hesitation about donating to, but the relief effort will begin soon.
Thank you, Professor Dunn. Professor Smith?
So I just wanted to add another aspect of relief that directly involves the US. Excuse me, we've seen rumors, intelligence about hit lists, target lists of NGO officials, refugees already in Ukraine from Russia and other places. So sorry. These folks will need visas in the US, and writing to your Congress people and pushing that effort is important.
Thank you so much. That is really, really important. We only have a few minutes left. Lots of great questions in the chat. It's really gratifying to see so many people in our webinar. At one point, we had over 600. I have a feeling some people had to go to a 5 o'clock meeting, and so our number is down to 448 right now, but still an incredible effort. And I want to thank all of my colleagues for taking time out of your busy schedules, for sharing your expertise. And again, on very short notice, we literally reached out to you all at noon, and by 4 o'clock, here you all were. So thank you so much. I think this really speaks to Indiana University's commitment to parsing current events, to supporting justice in the world, and thank you for being a part of that. I'd love to invite each panelist to say a few wrap-up words, anything that you didn't manage to say or that you think needs to be said before we break this evening. And I'll just remind everyone that we will be putting some resources together. You can find those on the REEI social media channels, hopefully starting tomorrow, and on the reei.indiana.edu website. So let me start with you, Irina, if I may. What would you leave us with this evening?
I would like to invite everybody who can join us tomorrow at the protest at 1 o'clock at the sample gates. Come with Ukrainian flags, come with posters. We need to be visible. There's not much we can do. I feel like I don't know what I can do other than speaking about the problem, talking to journalists. I already received a few emails from journalists. We have to be visible. We have to speak up. So please come to the sample gates tomorrow at 1 o'clock.
Thank you, Irina. There was a question in the chat. Where can we get a Ukrainian flag? Make one. Make a flag. Red and blue and yellow. That's all you need. That's all you need. Professor Smith, what would you leave us with this evening?
I would look for unintended consequences as yet anticipated. Some of those might come in places like Kazakhstan, which just had a spasm of protest, where the Russian military is not so popular, and neither is President Putin. Kyrgyzstan is already lobbying to cut off Russian TV in Kyrgyzstan. Armenia is likely to have similar issues. Georgia will harden its resolve. And so we're likely to see some really interesting cascading effects in the next couple of weeks.
Thank you. Professor Dunn?
Yeah, I'd like to say first that you will hear the argument advance now that this problem all comes from the advance of NATO, and that what should have happened is that Ukraine never should have been allowed to consider joining NATO. And that you will hear the argument also that Russia has a legitimate, quote unquote, sphere of influence where its security needs should be projected onto its neighboring countries. And I would like to encourage everyone to push back on that narrative. Ukraine is an independent country with the right to decide its own foreign policy and to choose its own alliances. And to buy into the notion that Russia has some sort of legitimate right to determine the fate and fortune of another country is to really tear down the fundamental idea behind democracy and the order of nation states. So reject that idea, please. And I'd also just like to reiterate that our thoughts and prayers are with the people of Ukraine tonight. We're also powerless to help them, but we are with them in spirit and we stand behind them.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Professor Borghi, what would you leave us with this evening?
Well, unfortunately, this terrible event reminded us that there's no international order. This is an anarchical society. There's an international system, but no order, which we tend to forget, unfortunately. We talked about economic sanctions, but there's also another tool that might even be employed, I don't know, but it's cyber. And if it is true that Russians are dissatisfied, that dissatisfaction could be fanned with letting Russians know how bad this is for their own country, contrary to what their president is telling them. And finally, just very quickly, one thing, resistance in Ukraine and sending them weapons, this sounds fine. But as American documents back in the Cold War always reminded, be careful not to make it suicidal. So we don't want to see more Ukrainian casualties. God knows what the Russians are capable of doing and are willing to do. So that should also be borne in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Colonel McVeigh?
I just wanted to say that I wanted to leave a little more optimistic assessment than that the U.S. established international rules-based order is dead based on the Russian full-scale invasion. I would say that although it's not dead, it's definitely on life support, and reviving the international-based order will depend largely on the Western response, which we're seeing as we sit here today. It'll take, in the long term, a reassessment of our policy or our strategies of deterrence, whether deterrence by denial or deterrence by punishment works. And we'll see a long-term possible reassessment of our U.S. Force posture decisions in Europe. Following the end of the Cold War, we moved a lot of U.S. forces out of Europe and back to the United States, and we may have to at least talk about that in the future.
Thank you. Professor Kinney, what would you leave us with?
You know, we live in an era of doom scrolling, and this moment where we start talking about, you know, return of World War and comparisons to Hitler in 1939 and so on. I just like to step back a bit and say, I mean, of course, everything's possible. It could be proven wrong, but I do not think that we need to be thinking about, you know, where will Putin stop? Instead, I mean, we need to be thinking very strongly, focusing on Ukraine and not thinking, you know, that he's going to roll onto the Atlantic Ocean. To the extent that we want to think more broadly around the world, I think absolutely the concern we should have is to signal that any appeasement of Putin would give to dictators around the world, particularly in China. But I remain optimistic that not only will Putin not advance further, but that his adventure in Ukraine will not succeed.
Thank you. Again, thank you to our panelists. This has been a very enlightening session. Really appreciate your analysis, and lots of kudos for everyone in the Q&A. We will do this again. So please stay tuned for further panels, further conversations. Again, from the Russian and East European Institute at IU, we stand in solidarity with Ukraine and the people of Ukraine, and just can't say enough about how much empathy we have for people, for what they are experiencing now. And thank you all for being here this evening. Thank you to our audience. The recording of this session will be posted on the REEI YouTube channel, so you can share it with friends and colleagues. Hopefully that will go up by tomorrow. And again, thanks everyone for coming, and thank you to our panelists for your really, really excellent insights. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Right.